The ship you see on the screen is the steamship called the Príncipe de Asturias. Between 1914 and 1916, she was the largest merchant ship in the Spanish Navy. And for its time, like other well-known ships such as the Titanic, the Prince of Asturias was once the most powerful, luxurious, and modern ship ever built. Inside, you could find mahogany bookcases, riveted leather seats, stained glass windows in all the colors, and floors decorated with Persian carpets. Yet despite appearances of extreme luxury, these ships concealed a reality much harsher and grimmer than it originally appears. Far below the decorated salons dedicated to passengers with money, the third-class decks were hidden. In these places, hundreds of poor travelers were crammed together like rats for weeks of travel. Hygiene was conspicuous by its absence, diseases spread like wildfire, and food and water shortages became a daily occurrence. To give you an idea, while on the ship, up to 150 people could travel in first class. The capacity for the third class was 10 times greater, about 1,500 people. And don't think that third class was low cost. Tickets could cost more than $1,000 in today's money. In fact, these ships were profitable thanks to low-income people in particular. They transported hundreds of them. They did it in bad conditions, and on top of that, they charged them a lot of money for the tickets. It was a healthy business. So why did so many poor people decide to embark on ships like this one? What made them want to pay so much money for voyages in such poor conditions? The answer is Latin America. Although today countries such as Argentina, Chile, and Venezuela seem very poor compared to the great powers such as Germany, France, or the United Kingdom, the truth is that during the first half of the 20th century, Latin American countries were the cradle of prosperity in the world. Like the US, Latin America became a land of opportunity for the poor people of Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Spaniards, Italians, French, and even Germans left the old continent in search of the Latin American dream, in search of a better life. I know it sounds hard to believe, but until the middle of the last century, Latin countries were as rich or richer than the great European powers. In fact, Venezuela had a better living standard than Germany. Even so, from the 1950s onwards, something changed. Something caused these countries to stagnate and fall far, far behind. Perhaps the most curious thing about all of this is that Latin America's economic problems does not seem to be a matter of a few specific countries. Somehow, it is as if the whole region started to become poor at the exact same time, with no exceptions. And the question, logically, is why? Well, there are many explanations. On this very channel, we made a video where we talked about corruption, populism, and excessive public intervention. But those aren't the only reasons. Other theories also point to geographic problems, trade enmities with the US, and even local capitalist elites. And probably many of those things have had an influence. However, in this video, we're going to explain one of the most interesting theories of all. One theory suggests that the culprit for Latin economic stagnation was its great success in the early 20th century. In other words, countries like Argentina, Chile, and Venezuela died of success. They did not know how to manage their economic growth and ended up condemned to poverty. Latin America became too rich to prosper. So, how can countries die of success and do it all at once? Today on VisualEconomik, we're going to tell you all about it. So stay tuned. The 21st of November, 1947, Havana in Cuba. A group of men in suits with important political positions and gathered under the banner of the UN made a decision that changed the economic course of Latin America forever. That decision was the origin of all the economic ills that the Latin Americans faced thereafter. But let's break it down. Why was that meeting in Havana so important? What did the UN have to do with all of this? What was that terrible decision? The beginning of this whole story starts in the countryside. Between the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, Latin America became the breadbasket of the world. At that time, America was a territory of vast and fertile land, ready to produce for the length and breadth of the world. Argentine meat, Colombian coffee, Brazilian rubber, and also minerals such as Chilean copper. All of them were the basis of the great economic success of the region. In a way, capitalism in the 19th century divided the world into two great blocks. On the one hand, Europe and the USA, which were engaged in industrial production, and on the other hand, Latin America, which was mainly engaged in the production of raw materials. For a long time, both sides lived in harmony and prosperity. Nevertheless, between the 1930s and the 1950s, things began to change completely. A group of economists nicknamed the Structuralists and led by Raúl Prebisch, who, as the man you see on screen, began to say that Latin America had to abandon the production model we have just explained. According to these structuralists, Latin countries had to stop focusing on raw materials and start focusing on industrial production, the manufacture of cars or machinery that would be a good example. Yes, absurd as it sounds, the structuralists went against the model that had so far enriched Latin countries. The question is, why? Well, mainly for three reasons. The first was that, as time went by, the prices of raw materials, especially those coming from the countryside, began to fall. It was thought that the agricultural production would become less and less profitable, and that this would condemn the region to poverty. The second reason was that the primary sector was very volatile and exposed. Periods of natural disasters such as floods or droughts could seriously affect the agricultural economy, and this was something that had to be avoided. But third, and perhaps the most important reason of all, was that by devoting all economic resources to raw materials, Latin America became extremely dependent on foreign industry. Latin countries had almost no industries of their own with which to manufacture machines, technology, or basic necessities. If, for whatever reason, whether due to an exchange rate crisis, an internal conflict, or simple political stubbornness, the region was left without access to foreign industries, the dependence could cause serious economic problems.
In detail, the main reason that worried the structuralists was the constant exchange crisis of the time. In periods of low agricultural exports, due to bad harvests or natural disasters, foreign currencies such as the dollar stopped arriving in Latin America. This prevented local companies from importing foreign goods needed for their production, since they simply did not have dollars to buy abroad, and this triggered major economic recessions.
In short, these three major problems of Latin American commodity model led the structuralists to one conclusion. If Latin America wanted to continue advancing economically, it had to industrialize, abandon its dependence on agriculture, and start setting up factories by the bucket load. The question is, how could this be achieved? And furthermore, if it is possible that this process could have occurred gradually on its own, the question then became, how is this process to be accelerated and doped? Well, that's where the Havana meeting made sense. The political leaders of Latin American countries met to devise a plan to industrialize Latin America and transform its economy. This plan was known as the Import Substitution Industrialization model. And visual economic community, it was probably the biggest failure in the region's economic history. The main reason why Latin countries are poor today. Do you want to know why? Of course you do. So let's find out.
Importing is important.
The Import Substitution Industrialization Model, or ISI, using its acronym, consisted of practically prohibiting foreign products and forcing citizens to buy products manufactured exclusively in Latin American territory. So why? The logic behind all of this went that the citizens could buy from local companies only, those companies could earn more money and thus develop much more than if they had to compete with foreign companies. To achieve all this, governments established three types of measures that changed everything. First, they established huge tariffs and trade barriers to foreign consumer products. For example, if you wanted to buy a car or a washing machine from Germany, you could pay up to double the price in tariffs. As you can imagine, this made it almost impossible for citizens to buy foreign products. However, in all of this, there was one exception. Industrial companies that wanted to import machines and technology from other countries were exempt from these tariffs. In fact, governments supported companies buying foreign technology with artificial exchange rates. Why though? Because in this way, companies could take advantage of technological progress abroad to develop rapidly and thus satisfy the local market more easily. You know, the key to everything was to substitute foreign products for local products, and to do this, the national industries needed many privileges to get started. Of course, these privileges did not come for free. In order for local companies to import foreign technology easily, they needed dollars, a lot of dollars. So where did these dollars come from? They came out of harming exporting companies with unfavorable and overvalued exchange rates. The import substitution model did not want to achieve a strong export industry, but rather the opposite, a strong industry for the domestic market, a self-sufficient industry that did not depend on imports from abroad. This is one of the big differences with respect to the South Korean model that we saw recently on our sister channel, VisualPolitik. The fact is that in order to achieve this, Latin governments harmed the export sectors in exchange for favoring new domestic industries. Be that as it may, this was only the first measure of the ISI model, but there were more. Meanwhile, Latin American governments, in their desire to reduce dependence on foreign countries, put all kinds of obstacles in the way of companies from other countries that wanted to set up their factories in the region. In other words, it was not enough for politicians to block imports and favor local industry, but that local industry had to be owned by local entrepreneurs, not by evil foreign capitalists, which, as you can probably guess, had one huge problem. And that is that without knowledge and skilled labor, it is very difficult for local entrepreneurs to set up advanced factories in completely new sectors. Think of it this way. way. How do you start a car or an airplane company from scratch if you have no experience in making cars or airplanes? Well, either you have a lot of money and you want to risk losing it all, or you just don't do it. So faced with this problem, Latin governments came up with a second solution: to set up public companies in a crazy way to reach where private companies did not dare to invest. Not surprisingly, along the way, they ran up a lot of debt, as you probably know. Which, by the way, brings us to the third measure of the ISI plan. You see, in order to make local companies even stronger, governments started to extend a lot of aid packages to them. Here, we are talking about subsidies, tax cuts, tailor-made infrastructure construction, direct investments of state capital, and extremely cheap credit. All of this came at an enormous cost to the public coffers. Debt skyrocketed, and in addition, governments began to hit the printing press to be able to pay for everything. The point is that these three major measures were the basis of the ISI model, and in turn, they were also the basis for the total and resounding economic failure of Latin America. The question is, why? And what went wrong? Well, let's find out. On the one hand, the public companies promoted by the government were a real disaster. In many cases, they became agencies for political recruitment and hiring. In other cases, they were used to pursue electoral objectives, such as supplying extremely cheap products that did not allow the companies to obtain profitability or grow. And finally, corruption, bureaucracy, and lack of experience turned them into zombie companies, incapable of producing anything of sufficient quantity, adequate quality, and at a reasonable cost. On the other hand, do you remember that the government was punishing exporting companies in order to favor new local industries? Doing so caused the export sector, and especially its small companies, to collapse completely. To give you an idea, Argentina lost millions and millions in export revenues in 1951, and it was only able to recover them after 12 years of suffering in 1963. Given that, and the fact that the government was obsessed with favoring large local companies, power ended up concentrated in very few hands. Private companies became rentiers, parasites of subsidies, and with great power to eliminate competition entirely. If we add to all of this a lack of experience in the industrial sector, the result was that products of the Latin factories were of very poor quality, were barely diversified, and very expensive compared to international standards. In other words, they couldn't compete. But there was still more. As we mentioned earlier, governments used the banknote printing press in an uncontrolled way. And what happened? Well, the usual thing happened. Inflation by the bucket load, and a gigantic public debt in foreign currency. The recipe for disaster. The curious thing is that by the 1970s, everyone realized that the import substitution industrialization model was a tremendous mistake. Even so, apart from a few countries like Chile, the rest of the region kept trying the same failed formula over and over and over again. In fact, in political debates in places like Argentina, there is still a strong phobia of foreign trade and a great love of favoring local industries. The question is, why is it that if the ISI model failed miserably, no one rectified it in time? Well, here comes the most interesting part of this video, the part that explains why Latin America was too wealthy to prosper. So stay tuned.
Looking outward.
At the same time that Latin countries wanted to industrialize with the ISI model, there was another place in the world that wanted to industrialize as well. Here, we are talking about East Asian countries like Taiwan and South Korea. The point is that these countries did not use the ISI model to industrialize, but used the Export-Orientated Industrialization Model, or EOI for short. This model, unlike the ISI model, did not seek to protect local industries from foreign industries in domestic markets. Rather, its objective was to support local industries to compete in the international market. That is, to sell their products abroad. In general, the Asian model was a model much more open to the international market, friendly to foreign companies willing to invest in their country, and was essentially underscored by the advantage of producing with very cheap labor. And, as you may already know, this model was a resounding success. Countries like South Korea and Taiwan are very rich today, and thanks to not competing abroad and not enjoying privileged local markets, companies like Samsung and TSMC became really successful. The question is, why didn't Latin countries replicate this Asian model when the ISI model failed? The first reason, which is the one that gives us the title to this video, is that the population of Asian countries during those times was very poor, and they had not developed large urban centers, and almost all of them made a living from cultivating the fields. So what did this mean? Well, you see, one of the measures to support the Asian export model consisted of the famous devaluations. That is, making the currency cheaper so that foreigners could buy more from you. This was very favorable for Asian farmers since the government favored exports with devaluations, and they benefited because they could export their agricultural products more easily. The problem in Latin America America, however, was that its population was much wealthier, many lived in urban centers, and devaluations became very unpopular with workers who could not benefit directly from them. Somehow, the devaluations were interpreted as a way to favor export companies and rural elites at the expense of workers. In the same vein, something to keep in mind is that at the time, salaries in Latin countries were much higher than those in Asian countries. And remember, we said that the Asian export model was based on cheap labor? It turns out that in Latin America, that labor was not so cheap. In order to compete with the international market with such a model, countries like Venezuela would have to devalue their currency so much as to reduce the cost of wages by as much as 1/8. As you can imagine, that would have come at a huge cost to workers through such things as inflation, but it would also have come at a huge political cost. At the end of the day, applying a model like the Asian one would have meant cutting a great deal of welfare for the population in the short term in exchange for potential long-term results that were not even certain. And tell me, what politician would have been willing to assume that cost? None of them. This is something that did not affect Asian countries as much. Firstly, because being so poor, devaluations were not costly for workers. And secondly, because Asian political leaders were not so influenced by corruption or by local elites. Countries such as Korea and Taiwan had suffered great war conflicts, the Japanese occupation, and various social revolutions that practically left all these countries without powerful elites. However, in the case of Latin America, what can I say? The ISI model developed large local industrial elites. To abandon the failed model would have been to abandon its privileges, and after all, Latin politics never stood out for its resistance to corruption and favoritism towards elites. But does all this mean that there was no other alternatives? That Latin America could not have taken advantage of its resources and opted for another model, such as that of Australia or New Zealand, to get ahead? Well, of course, yes. The problem is that this would have been a stiff breeze for the industrial elite and also for the political class. They would have had to make many changes to recover the lost ground, and they were simply not in the mood. So all of this, among other factors that we do not have time to explain in a single video, led Latin American countries to end up stuck in the ISI model, a model with no future which condemned the region to poverty. Be that as it may, at this point, it's over to you. Do you think that countries like Argentina will be able to abandon their phobia of foreign trade that stems from the ISI model? Do you think that Latin America is in time to replicate the success of Asian countries? What other factors that we have not had time to explain do you think condemned Latin American countries to pursue the ISI model again and again? You can leave me your answers in the comments below. As always, don't forget that here on VisualEconomik, we release new videos every single week. Subscribe to our channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. I hope you enjoyed the video. All the best, and I'll see you next time.